Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on December 12th with Catherine Grant on Understanding Source Tagging in Family Search Family Tree. Please note that starting January 2025, our webinars will be on Wednesdays instead of Thursdays, but still at 5 p.m. Our first webinar of 2025 will be on Wednesday, January 8th. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner on Cluster Research is Not Just for Brick Walls. Before we begin, here's a little bit about James. James Tanner has over 18 years as a family history volunteer and is presently serving at the BYU Library Family History Center. He is on the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association and has 7 children and 34 grandchildren. And we'll now turn the time over to James.
Okay, thank you. Everybody be able to hear and see? Good. Okay, today, welcome to the webinar here on BYU Center, BYU Library Family History Center, which is the actual new name of the library. And we are going to be talking about cluster research, and it's something that's been around for many, many years, but it is not generally part of most of the people who do genealogical research is, let's call it, their forefront. That's not something that they're aware of and use more very frequently. Some of us have been doing this for many years and just do it naturally without even thinking that we're actually doing something different. So we need to just understand how and where that's happening. Okay, so in the reality out there, and I talked to lots and lots of people over a year, I can't even keep track. But one of the things that I notice is that many genealogists, family historians, or whatever, focus on doing their research one person at a time by looking for direct line ancestors. In other words, there's a common and there are many reasons for doing this, but there's a common pattern of doing genealogical research that goes back on your, either your father's line or your mother's line, and and one of the things that adds to that kind of perception of genealogy in general is that is the fan chart, because the fan chart leaves little blank spaces where there are no further ancestors, and that's kind of, people can say, oh, we've got to fill in the blanks. Well, that may be true, and that may be the case, but the interesting thing about that is that there's usually a reason for the end of the line or the missing people, especially on the family search family tree, because it's been around, and the data that's been added to it is well over 100, began well over 100 years ago. So sometimes those missing people on the family charts are people that have been looked for over 100 years. So it's just a matter of understanding that kind of perspective. But one of the other questions, of course, is that this isn't necessarily the only thing that we're concerned about, because every ancestral line will eventually end. So no matter how much information, how much work you do, how much research you do, there are simply ends to the lines where records about those particular set of people on that ancestral line were never kept, or were destroyed, or were never available. And so finding the people past a certain point there's always sort of an end there. But if we think that end is premature, like it's your grandfather or your grandmother, and it's back, and we're not talking about records going back into the 1500s or anything like that, then we call it a brick wall. And that basically indicates that there's some external force that's preventing us from getting back and learning about our ancestors. But that's kind of a reverse perception. It's not that there's actually a brick wall, it's that we haven't found the key or to doing it and finding the information from our ancestors that may be available. It's something, and basically I would call it a lack of learning in that particular area. But what's more important is, and here's what I was talking about a moment ago, and that is, this is a line from one of my great grandparents, and you can see that there are quite a few blank spaces here. And the question on these is, because the blank spaces would be back in the early 1700s, is to whether or not the records are even available at that time. And so there's some things that we need to do to, let's call it, fill in the reality of the people that we're dealing with and determine whether or not there is any research. In other words, if determining if records exist. And that may become a bigger task than actually searching the records once we found the records. So what happens, though, in this case is that people kind of obsess on a particular ancestor, and they will just keep looking for additional records for that direct line ancestor as long as, as they are involved in genealogy. I have to admit that I do have some of those people in that category. I have my Tanner family line goes back to the 1600s in Rhode Island. And only recently, because of some technological advances in full text searches on Family Search, have I been able to find additional information about him that I hadn't found already after many years of doing research off and on about that particular person. So the question, though, if you're just going back and there's the person there, and you keep trying to find more and more records about that person, it's really kind of like this analogy here. It's like digging a hole to find a treasure, and then when you don't find it, you dig deeper and deeper. Well, digging deeper and deeper doesn't mean that the treasure is someplace in that hole down that far. And that's the same thing that happens with the research. Doing more and more research does not mean that there's going to be any more information about that individual. It may be, and it may not be. But one of the things that we obviously need to consider is that we're digging in the wrong place. And we may have a very clear understanding of where this is talking about. But what we're doing here, and the discussion that I'm going to do right now, is how we approach that from a completely different angle. In other words, we're not digging deeper, we're digging more broadly, and we're including more people in the area of where we're looking. And we'll see how that works. So we're cluster research now, as we've used it for years. And it's sometimes there's a phrase that had been coined by Elizabeth Shown Mills, one of the more prominent genealogists, called FAN, which is Family, Associates, and Neighbors, opens up the genealogical view. By extending the breadth of our research, meaning including more people in our research that surround around the target person, then the chances of us finding records and determining that perhaps our information was incorrect and we've been looking in a wrong place is going to be the results of that more extensive research. So cluster research includes researching complete families. First of all, I find that often there'll be the father and mother in the family, the parents of the family, will have some, not maybe not extensive research, but a number of sources on Family Search or in some of the other websites. And but the children, nothing. Maybe a name, and maybe not even a record, maybe just a name for the child. And if you were considering those parents to be the end of the line or the brick wall, the difficult family, then the obvious thing to do would be to make a complete family, begin doing research on each of the children to the extent that you've been doing research on the parents, so that you have all the records that the children have made available. The advantage of that, obviously, is the children are a little bit closer in time to you as you're doing that research, and you're able to use that additional information that you find on the children to more focus. So, for example, if you find that you don't know where the father was born, it's common. And you read down through the children, and the children's records are available, and every child was born in the same place. Well, then you can always make the assumption that the parents, were also married, or at least married in that place or close to that place, and were people from that area. This is especially true as you go further back in time, and travel restrictions became uh, one of the most predominant issues with trying to make families go great distances. They just didn't do that. So here, what we do, though, is we include that, but we also expand the research from just that family core to all the possible people, the neighbors, the relatives, associates, in many different cases. And that's done by using a very broad spectrum of records and using individuals that are suggested by those records to do additional research. Now, why is that? And I will probably say this more than once, but what it is, the core of that is that people tend to congregate in areas where they have associates, where they have relatives. Not so much today. Today, that's kind of with our fast transportation and being able to fly around the world and on a day or 2 days or whatever, their children may be in different places around the world, and the family may be scattered. But as you go back in time, even back into the 1950s and back into the 1940s, early 1900s, that ability to travel and the ability to live in different places begins to collapse entirely. And going back in time, there are large studies that have indicated that people lived within 6 miles of where they were born, where they were married, and where they died and were buried. And so when we focus on cluster research, we're focusing on that kind of focus of a 10-mile or 6 to 10 mile circle around the birth date of a child. And that's where we should find the records of the parents and all of the rest of the family members. And that's, it's fairly, that's accurate. Let's say it's not 100% positive, but it's high enough percentage time that we use this as a very valuable tool. So what it turns out is that cluster research is a methodology for resolving issues such as similar or the same names, conflicting dates, places of origin of an ancestor, and also the brick walls, the end of line people. This is a photograph of one of my ancestors and his descendants. The gentleman sitting down at the left of the tree is my great-great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, and these are all of his living descendants at the time. And they're all in an area that with fairly good contact between each other. And it would be possible to determine the names and relationships of everybody in that picture. And the person who's there's one younger lady that's standing sort of in the middle and staring straight out in a white dress, kind of back in the third row, and she's my grandmother. So this is kind of an example of what we mean by cluster research. A cluster is all those people plus their neighbors, their friends, and their associates. And that gives us an overall view of the whole organization. And once again, I is speaking as a person who helps individuals over a long period of time. Been doing this now for going on 21 years. They need to update the introduction. That genealogists tend to view their ancestors and their relatives out of the context. In other words, they're a name, they're a date, their place, their certificates, their photos, but they're still not in context in the way that in the time and the place where all of those events occurred. And that context is part of the cluster research. We have to know why are these people related? How are they moving? Where are they going? What are their motivations? And what places could they have possibly been found? And that goes well beyond the idea of simply pounding away looking for birth, marriage, and death records and those other kinds of things that may not exist in the culture or time that the people were being when they were living. And what occurs to me, for example, as an example, is I do a great deal of research for people and helping people in Latin America, in Spanish-speaking countries, and because I'm doing a lot of Spanish research, it's all primarily with records that have been kept by the Catholic Church, and those Catholic Church records are created in small communities, and so the people on any given record in a parish are probably, it's very likely that the greater number of these people, of each of all those people, are related, that everyone in that parish is probably related. The reason is those parishes persisted for hundreds of years without any particular change, without people leaving or coming. So and that's maybe not the case in other places, and some places are more mobility, or there were wars, or there were other causations that would indicate that the family was no longer in the same place that they were. So what we need to do is put each of the ancestors, each ancestor and relative, into the place and time they lived. So we need to know where they were and what that entailed. And another good example of this is records in Europe for Poland. And Poland is a place that changed hands back and forth as there were empires and wars, and at some point in time, and many times subsequently, there are at least 3 different names for for the vast majority of the cities and towns. They're in Russian, they're in German, and they're in Polish. And it depends on the time frame as to whether the people were living in a German-held empire, or the Russian Empire, or Poland. And so this happens too, and it happens in the United States, but it happens in ways that are not obvious. For example, the changes in county boundaries and the formation of new counties, and the fact that records have a tendency to move with over time. So these are the kinds of things that we're investigating. And we call this, of course, back to the beginning, we call this cluster research because it gives us a simple term to refer to this entire process of expanding the research beyond the focus, like the total focus on the individual family. And I mean, it's important just, I think, to even take a step back and say, we are researching a family in a neighborhood, in a society, in a nation. And so we need to really understand that. We need to broaden our sense of what we feel is appropriate to do as genealogists, and start to break out of the cage we put ourselves in of focusing so much on birth, marriage, death, and census records that that's all we ever think are important. So think about this, and if see if you can do this. And this picture was taken uh, a little bit over 100 years ago. And the question is, how different would you be if you had lived here? What would your daily life and the relationships you had with your neighbors and those around you be if you were back in this group of people who, by the way, are early pioneers in the West? And these are some of they're the older people who are pioneers. And so basically, you're looking at history, and that history says one thing that's probably prominent and not obvious about this is I would assume that everyone in this picture knew everyone else in the picture and had some sort of relationship, because these people had lived together and been in the same circumstances for many, many, many years when the picture was taken. And they were probably all much, much younger when they crossed the plains or came from Utah to Arizona or whatever. So the first step is to research all the people you find in your families as a first step. So as long as you find, as long as you have everyone researched at the same, to the same depth and level, and have used many more records and many more different records, those records are going to start showing up additional people all the time. And those are going to be friends, relationships, relatives, and other people, associates in business and whatever. And as those records are uncovered, and as they start to make, as you start to discover those additional names, then as you begin to look for those people, you begin to get a focus on that family. Now, that doesn't become an isolated family living out in the desert in Arizona or Utah or back east in the small town or whatever. They are people who had a lot of associations over their lifetimes with a quite a restricted but very identifiable group of people. And if the question, of course, is, and the ultimate question, obviously, in many cases, is where did the immigrant come from? And you're trying to determine where the immigrant came from, you would certainly be looking for all the people in that small area and trying to find out if someone had a record that told where they all came from. And and if you found such a record, you could then make the assumption that your ancestor, who was living in that small community, probably came from that same area, because there's a very direct relationship between the what the place that the people live when they came to America or came to a different country, whichever country they come to, and those people who were surrounding them, because they went there where their language was the same, their culture was the same, and they felt comfortable with the people that were surrounding them. So what we're doing is to branch out and look to what you already have, and then ask the question of what you're missing, and then do the additional research. So what are you missing? You're missing the place of origin of the person, of the immigrant, or you're missing where this person came from that showed up in Iowa or in Michigan or Wisconsin or someplace. And you want to know where they came from, or they show up in the 1600s in in the colonies, and there's no answer. Perhaps doing more research and beginning to understand the times and how these immigrants came to America or came to the country of their arrival, that would help you to understand that and how what that actually meant. So my question is that what do dates for a birth, a marriage, and a death or burial tell you about how a person lived? And my answer is the same, not much and not enough. So it's it's a way to start. It gives you a starting point, it gives you a reference point, but what you have, what you're lacking here is putting that family into a a culture and a perspective that allows you to make additional discoveries about the family and about how those relationships occurred. One thing that we probably hear uh, about from time to time in genealogy is that it's extremely common for people to have the same names. I've been doing a lot of research in England, and I can tell you that Smith, Jones, Brown, um, uh, and a number of others, maybe in the neighborhood of 6 or 8 uh, given names, are the most common names in almost every county in England. So no matter where you're going, if your surname happens to be Smith or happens to be very common, you're going to have a tremendous difficulty differentiating between uh, individuals, because you're going to find people with the first given name who live very close and who are born and married and have children that have seem to have the same names. And this is a possibility. In one research that I did in England, for example, I had two people with two men with the same names. Their names were identical. They had, and then as I did research, their wives were the same, and I was almost certain that they were the same person, and that we had to, and I had to merge those two people. Well, I did merge them, and then I had to unmerge them because I just didn't feel like it worked out right. And then I kept searching, and eventually I found those both of those individuals on the same census record, and they were next door neighbors, and they did in fact have the same name, and their wives had the same name, and some of their children each had the same name as the other children. So when you're in that kind of situation, unless you go way beyond the normal records, and in that case, the key to that was their employment records, because over time their employment changed. But fortunately, in the British census records, you could watch, you could kind of see the people, even though they didn't ever leave, they were always mixed up, but they always had their own um, occupation, and that was consistent during their lives and the subsequent types of developments from that occupation. So that's some of the things you be too. And here, just a simple name like John Tanner. And Tanner isn't a particularly common name. Uh, it's more common than some, but it's not like a lot of Jones or Smith. But here's there 181,000 people in the family tree that would come up with a name that included John Tanner. Probably in the situation here, you're getting information that uh, goes out to all the numbers of people named John and all the people named Tanner, and not necessarily just John Tanner. But and there's still a very, very large number of people that you have to deal with. Now, interestingly, census record will help you to find and begin this process, because you can look, if you look carefully at a census record and examine it very closely, and then start to look at all the people that are listed as neighbors of the people that your target people, then you'll begin to see some interesting things. This is a record of in a town called St. John's, Arizona, which is in Apache County, and is where I grew up partially for a few years when I was young. I lived there, and then my family kept a home in the town, and every summer I would go back and spend virtually most of the summers in the town. And so I got to know a lot of people in the town, and found out how many of them were my relatives, which was very interesting. But so here we're going to look on this particular schedule uh, for the census in the 1900 census for somebody that I'm related to. So we look here closely, and the bottom entry is for Henry Oveson. Henry and Margaret were my great grandparents. And then his father, OVC Oveson, is right above him. So they were next door neighbors. But I found the interesting thing is that next door to the next door down, you'll see the numbers here, 1819, 1920, and 2021. These are sequential numbers of people living. So this, when the census record was taken, these people, the information was gathered as somebody moved from house to house and got this information. And so his name was David King Udall, David K. Udall. And he lived next door to Oveson's, and just down the street, or close to Henry Overson. Okay, so I'm directly related here. At the time this was this record was made, David King Udall, who was a next door neighbor, was married, and this is when there was polygamy, and he had more than one wife. He was married to my direct line ancestor, Mary Linton. And so here's a relationship that you would not know if you hadn't looked beyond the names of this particular uh, census record, this 1900 census record. If you just took out the names and then didn't ever look at it again, you may never have gone here and say, well, wait a minute, David King Udall is my step grandfather, and he is, and that's because Mary Ann Linton had a previous husband. And so this is who died, and this is, so there's a lot of history and a lot of family on both sides of my family. And that became, because you'll begin to see here that all of this is mixed up together. In other words, the more you get into these small towns, the more you get into the records, and even beginning with just census records, you begin to see how everybody is kind of related. I mean, this family doesn't, you never found that in your family before, but they're the descendants of this. Well, anyway, so it goes on and on like that. It turns out that there's just sort of a common kind of a web of people. Now, this is looking at another census record, and I did this simply because of the places. These are the first list column is the place where the person was born. That'd be the people in the enumerated names in the census. The second column would be where their father was born, and the third column would be where their mother was born. And this is just one area of a town, and it doesn't matter that of where this town was or what years it was. What's important here is that as you go down, their people are born in Ireland and then Illinois, and then Austria, Ireland. So there's different places, but the parents are born in Ireland, They're down, except the one from Austria, the German, or whatever country it happened to be in Austria. So what can you tell from this? These families may not be related. They may not have, but they all live together as neighbors. And so there is a possibility, and a very great possibility, that they all came from the same place in Ireland. And the same places in Illinois. So what we're looking at here is the beginnings of cluster research. Looking at all of these people, we may very well find someone who has some connection or has maintained some records from Ireland, and that record is available and tells us where these people all came from. And the chances are very great that if one of these people came from someplace in Ireland, that the rest of the people came from the same place. It's just the way that people live, and the way that they feel comfortable, and how they live their lives. And it may very well be, as you get it back into it, that all these people immigrated at the same time, or within the matter of a year or two of the same time from Ireland. So this is this is the interesting. This happens to be 1900 U.S. Census for Chicago, Cook County, Illinois. So this is all happening in Cook County. And as I mentioned, they may be related, they may be unrelated, but they may have all come from the same part of Ireland, enough to give you a place to start looking for records and start looking for connections to the actual country. So kind of to go through it again, we do a research for all of the people surrounding our target family. And that gives us a probability of finding the place of origin. And as you can see down here, there's long lists of people from the same areas. And they've married people from the same areas. So if they were marrying people and they were living in the area, then even if they're not related, their children are starting to be related. And so all these people have intermarried and created a group of people that can be analyzed and looked at, and even find out that as you go down that a lot of these are people with very, very similar birth dates, that they're all kind of the same age. So they came here, and if they did, and their children were born after they got here in the United States, and that gives us a point for all of these people coming. And even if your ancestor, for example, did not get naturalized, maybe half these other people did, or some of these people did get naturalized, and they may have gotten naturalized since the record may tell where they came from. So there's always some more trails to follow, more hints to follow here by analyzing and looking at this. Now, if you go down through this list, you'll see there's a group of people that came from Sweden. And my guess is those people were related and came together, because that would be more likely. So there is a possibility that some of these people are related, and they may be relatives that maybe not close relatives. Interestingly enough, the cemeteries are absolutely cluster research places because people have a tendency to be buried in the same places as their other relatives. Um, and that occurs, by the way, even if they are no longer associated with or living in that place. So they may have instructions that they want to be buried back in the hometown. And so that's what's happened here, because a lot of the people that are buried here in this little cemetery in northern Arizona called Joseph City are they're my ancestors, but the difference here is that they're all in family plots, and that a lot of these people had moved away and still were buried back here. So we're able to see, and all of their relatives and friends and everybody are the people surrounding them here in the cemetery. So once you've got this group of people and start to do some research on this group of people, you'll find the connections like I showed on that census record, where my great 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 no, my would be my great great grandfather was living next door to another great great grandfather, step grandfather, who married one of my grandmothers. So I think it's just obvious that small towns mean your neighbors may be your relatives. And it really kind of depends on the time and place of the town. But as you go back in time, um, I most of my life I spent in the Salt River Valley, living in Scottsdale, um, and Mesa and Phoenix. And when we got there, and when I was young and 8 years old, when I first moved into the valley from eastern Arizona, I the towns were all tiny towns. They were they were little teeny towns, and everybody in the surrounding towns, Mesa, Gilbert, Chandler, all were related people together. And it was a very cohesive and very close-knit communities. But now, well, Phoenix becomes one of the largest cities in the United States, and the Salt River Valley is overflowing with subdivisions. That may not be the case so much, but that does not mean that people still don't live um, in relative proximity to their friends and neighbors who have their same, if it's not the same religion, it's the same cultural or social level or background. And so that's how we can find where they live. And one way to do this, to show another cluster, is to start putting people on the map. Um, and when you do that, um, you can see how close the relationships were in some instances. In this case, when you put two relatives on this, blow this up and put it, the house down near the bottom, the closest to the bottom, is a house that uh, I lived in and then would come back to each summer. The house next door was an uncle, uh, an uncle in one of the families, the Jarvis families, that was my grandmother's family. And he was actually my grandmother's brother. So he was my uncle. As a 8-year-old, I had no contact much with him, but I did have contact with everybody else in the town, including him. So uh, even though my perceptions is that my perception was that I was related to practically everybody. So that's kind of the way it looked. So you may come up with the question of how many other types of records harbor clusters. Well, I thought it might be interesting for me to put those red dots on and then bring them up one by one, but I decided that was too much. And the answer is all these records. Every record that we have has a potential of creating an ability to initiate cluster research and they become interrelated as more of these records are used, more of these types of records are used, then we begin to see the clusters more clearly, and the relationships and how they lived and where they lived and how they got there and where they came from all becomes more and more obvious because those records are available. So perhaps you get the point. So all these records are helpful. There's nothing on this list that wouldn't lead you to some other kind of record. And basically, the the reason why this is the case, and that's how that happens, is that the records are created at the time or near the time of an event by someone who observed the event or had a duty to record the event. And so as all these people who have these different relationships, all the events in their lives are recorded through everything from newspapers to every other kind of record here up to cemeteries. They basically show their relationships to each other. Either they're relatives or not, but that's another issue. And the fourth rule of genealogy, you may have heard the first rule of genealogy, and if you haven't heard the rules of genealogy, you can look them up on Google with my name, because I've put in about, I don't know, I think 13 or 14 rules. But the first rule is when the baby was born, the mother was there. The fourth rule is there are always more records. Now, that can be disputed. But as far as practical realities are concerned, as far as your individual research is concerned, there are always more records because no one has ever exhausted all the records. And I know that because I know genealogists who are what you would call extremely talented researchers and have done extensive research, and they have spent years looking for records for their particular area. And guess what? They always find more records. It just seems to be the issue. And so from the standpoint of any individual's research, there are always more records. Now, one of the things that we have today are computers, and we have AI, and we have a whole lot of other things now that are giving us ways to do searches, ways to do our research and everything else. And one of the things that helps to identify all these people and put them into some kind of category is to use a spreadsheet and enter the categories, your categories, and the records of, for example, and what I would do this on originally was when I was doing the initial research was to see that I had the census records for each one of the individual family members. So I would list all the family members, and then I would start writing in each of the census records that they were found in. And so that I was able to get every census record for every family member. And that's a lot easier than it was at the time I was doing this research. But the idea of using a formal structure like this to begin your research is not new and is not old. It's still a very, very, very valuable way to organize. There may be other programs that help organize. Now, one of the things I do extensively when I get into this to the wit level that I'm talking about as far as looking is using research notes. And sometimes people have a formal form for the research notes. I don't use a form. I use a long entries in a book. This entry is on a note-taking program, Microsoft's program, and helps me just give me all the information I need to know. And I color coded so that you can see what's available. This was back when I had to order files and they weren't at BYU, so I had to look at them, and then they were reviewed once, and then they became working files. And now all this is actually sort of becoming outmoded because now we have full text search and using AI to create to read the handwriting and all of that information. And I was able now using that, waiting until the technology changed, but getting into it and actually finding the deeds that I was looking for William Tanner, and the probate records that I'm looking for are still hiding, but we've been able to uh, get enough records on the deeds that we have established the family that was identified years ago. And one of the things that we need to overcome is concerns or reservations about doing research about people you may be, or are probably not related to. In other words, is it somehow wrong to do research for people you're not related to? And the answer is no, not at all. There's no reason at all you can't do the research for all these people. Dead people do not have privacy rights. You're not violating anybody's whatever. The only thing that may occur is that you may end up either providing information to people that they either don't know about or don't expect. And secondly, that may contradict some of the things that they may have already known about or thought they knew about their family. So yeah, it's not as quite as that. We have all these people with their kind of blank faces because we don't know who they are until we do the research. One thing this will do is to open old doors. So as you go back in your records and back in your time, you may find that there's information that you have not found previously. One of the lines, my family lines, went back to my great-great-grandfather. His name was Charles Godfrey de Vries Jarvis. When he was older person, he liked the Jarvis family and was adopted into the Jarvis family, whether it was real or simply just convenience, but he took the name Jarvis. And so his wife was Margaret Jarvis, so all the children were Jarvises, not DeFrieses. But anyway, so his DeFries line ended in England. And when it ended, it was obvious that these people were Jewish. And so basically, that was where it was for years. All the years that I was doing research for the last, let's say, 40 years, that was the end of the line. They ended with George de Vries in England. And it turned out that as I began to do more research at some point in time, I discovered the fact that a committee in Israel had done a research on all the DeFrieses, all the people, all of the Jews who lived in the Netherlands from the 1630s. This was online, it was available, and it was completely sourced. Told you all the sources where they got all the information. And that record enabled me to start back on that line and on many other lines by using the information that was now available that hadn't been available previously to any of my genealogy oriented ancestors. So you can open those old doors and get out into the world with the new records that are being produced at all the time. Okay, well, any questions anybody wants to answer? I mean, get me to answer or whatever.
There was a question about the rules that you mentioned that he
They're on,
wrote.
yeah, they're on my blog. My blog is called Genealogy's Star. And if you do a research with my name, James Tanner, Rules of Genealogy, it'll come up with all the blog posts I did over the years, accumulating the various rules. That's the fastest way to get to it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on December 12th with Catherine Grant. She will be giving a presentation on understanding source tagging in Family Search Family Tree. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.